Well, now that you've quieted down, I guess we have to start. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our evening community forum. Delighted you're here. My name is Abhi Janamanchi. I'm one of the ministers who serves Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church. We're a community where love works. Rick, I think there's a slight feedback. Just a slight tad. Let's try it. So we have these forums once a month in the evening on a Sunday to bring the community together to be engaged with questions of what we say intimate and ultimate concern, and also invite speakers who are able to address some of the issues that we are engaged with or struggling with in our country today. And so it's a real joy today to have our guest speaker to share some insights, both his personal journey as well as speak on themes that you may be holding in your hearts. But I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to ask one of our members, who is a good friend of his, David Devlin Foles, to come forward and introduce our evening speaker. David?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Abhi. It's always a bit disquieting, I guess, to introduce a speaker who is the author of an autobiographical memoir, because I don't want to step on Haroon's lines, but I will say Haroon is just on the basic facts. He is a fellow in Jewish-Muslim, or as he might prefer to say, Muslim-Jewish relations at Shalom Hartman Institute in New York. But without stepping on his lines, without revealing what Haroon will tell you for himself from his own very powerful memoir, I can say I've experienced working with Haroon and having the privilege of his friendship for a couple of years now. And he is, I can promise you, a brilliant commentator on Islam, on interfaith relations, and on the Middle East. A regular contributor on CNN, where many of you may have seen him, and a wonderful travel companion in Jerusalem and Israel and the West Bank and beyond. His book describes experiences that are familiar to many people here at Cedar Lane, that of experiencing doubts about one's faith, the faith of one's family, the faith of one's community, experiencing those doubts. In Haroon's case, this was complicated, I think, by the crisis of faith that he experienced as a young man when he was called upon to be, as he puts it, a professional Muslim, the spokesperson for Islam in the wake of 9/11 as just an undergraduate student at NYU. And that forced him to really rethink his relationship with Islam, his relationship with his faith. But he came through that to a deeper conviction and a deeper level of understanding of that faith. And that, I think, was what was for me so powerful and moving about meeting him and discussing religion and faith with him, but also what's so deeply moving about his book. For all that these sound like heavy topics, please be assured that Haroon will leaven all of this with a great dose of his trademark self-deprecating humor. So let me say nothing else but to introduce with great pleasure Haroon Moghul.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I on? I am on. Oh no, I'm very much on. Yeah. Before whoever lied to me before, and I'm just kidding. So my name is Haroon, obviously. Abhi, thank you so much for opening this space to me. David, who's right behind me, for picking me up from the airport. Although I did not want to get off the plane, I attempted to create a scene to see if I could be flown back to California, because it's California. I've been on a book tour now for pretty much since the book came out in early June, and the last two stops on the tour have been Miami and California. And so I live a very warped sense of time and season. The day before Thanksgiving, I was on a beach in Miami, deeply confused because in my mind, one does not associate Thanksgiving and the beach. nor does one associate early December with palm trees, at least where I come from. So, but I'm actually happy to be here, although you did take me away from California. So I'm a little bit hurt. I'll get over it. I'll find my way back. So actually, on the ride here, David asked me a little bit on how I ended up writing a book with Beacon, which is a Unitarian Universalist press out of Boston. And I thought the story was funny, so I would tell you the full story, and that way give you something entertaining to think about. I grew up in New England, between Massachusetts and Connecticut, and the first college campus I visited at an age when I knew what a college campus was Yale, New Haven. And I don't know how many people have been to Yale campus. It's beautiful. It's one of these gorgeous college campuses that whether or not you go there, you go visit it, and it's this remarkable place. And I told myself I want to go to Yale. And given that my family is Pakistani, anything that indicates academic success or ambition is always looked very warmly upon. So I announced to my father that I wanted to go to Yale, and he finally looked at me as if I had said something worth saying, which might have been the first time in my life that it ever happened. I found out a few weeks into my junior year that you could take college classes at Yale as a high school student. And so they had a special summer program for high school students to take introductory level courses in humanities and some sciences. And so I signed up for modern social theory in the sociology department and introduction to philosophy. I was very excited, and so between my junior and senior years in high school, I took those courses and I loved it. I had an absolutely great time. I met a lot of really cool people. I learned things that I never really imagined I would be able to learn. And I developed a relationship with my sociology professor such that when fall 1998 came around and it was time for me to apply for college, I thought I had Yale in the bag because, I had Yale college courses on my transcript. I'd proven that I could hack it at the institution itself, and I had a recommendation from a Yale college professor. So as far as I was concerned, all the other applications were perfunctory and unnecessary. Sahel knows how the story ends because Sahel knows me from NYU. So Sahel already knows where this story is going, so he's kind of judging me quietly. So April 1st, I got my rejection letter from Yale. I wrote back very funny because it was April Fool's Day. They did not respond. Incidentally, I found this out as amazing. I don't know if this is across the board at these universities, but I met a guy at Yale that summer who was an international student from Turkey, and he told me that when he got his acceptance letter, the first thing he got with the acceptance letter was a bill for the post, right? So they sent him the letter by DHS courier, express mail internationally, congratulating him on his admission to Yale University, and then charged him for the cost of the letter, which I thought was amazing, right? So they get you from the very beginning. So anyway, I got rejected by Yale, and I went to NYU, and I'm not bitter about that. I actually had a great time at NYU, and a lot of the story has to do with NYU. But for the purpose of the story of the book, 14 years passed, and you'll get soon enough a sense of what I did in those 14 years. But in 2012, after many, many years of writing and publishing and so on and so forth, an editor from, of all places, Yale University Press reached out to me and said, I'd like to meet you for coffee at a place called Blue State Coffee, which is a coffee chain in New Haven. I'm sure you can understand the reference. It does not have to do literally with the color. So I said, sure, why not? I took the Metro North Railroad up to New Haven, and I met her, and she said to me, you have a book in you. And I said to myself, wow, that's kind of amazing. I didn't know what I had in me, but apparently I have a book in me. That's very exciting. And she told me that she wanted me to write a textbook about Islam in America, which, by the way, if any of you are ever planning to write a book, this is some gold mine advice I'm giving to you for free. There's certain things in the publishing world that guarantee you, if not immortality, at least health insurance. So, and there's a connection, right? So the first of these is, so there's tiers, right? The first of these is, if you're on Oprah or the Costco book table, you've made it, right? Because if you're on the Costco book table, there's only 10 other people who will ever be on that book table with you, right? So you're now world famous, at least in Costco, right? You can have Oprah. Oprah's amazing because then everyone's going to read your book. Even if they don't actually read your book, they buy your book. And ultimately you don't care if anyone reads your book, you just care if they buy your book, right? That's a secret that all writers know but never will tell you. And then, because then sometimes like, oh, I read your book from the library, and you're like, oh, right? So you're like, you should be happy, but you're kind of like, your first thought is like, oh, it's stupid socialism. So the public library makes every writer into a capitalist. Which is funny because we all grew up on the public library system. So it's funny how where you are in a situation depends on your political orientation. Anyway, the two things that are gold mines for writers, one is book clubs, because word of mouth, right? So people in book clubs, they read passionately, they recommend books, and then the people they talk to are likely to buy books, right? You don't just want someone to talk about your book, you want the kind of people to talk about your book who are going to buy your book. And the second is academic textbook. Because if you get assigned on a university campus, it means hundreds of people at this very impressionable point in their life are going to be reading your book. And then they're going to be telling their friends about it, they're going to be reading it, and it's just sort of, chain reaction. And then year after year after year, your book gets reassigned. To give you an extreme and absurd example, George Orwell's 1984 is perennially a bestseller. We don't see it on the New York Times bestseller list because it's perennially a bestseller, but one of the reasons is because it's assigned in so many academic campuses and contexts, right? So people keep buying it year after year after year. So when she told me that she wanted me to write an academic textbook, I got really, really excited, and I said to myself, this could be it. This could be my break, my foot in the door in the publishing industry. And I'd wanted to write, and I'd written before, but nothing had ever really gone the way I'd wanted it to. And so I said to myself, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it a priority. I'm going to write a book about Islam in America. And I planned the whole thing out. I wrote it out. I even dedicated it to the Yale admissions office because I thought it would be amazing. Like, see, truly God works in mysterious ways, right? Like, I thought in 1998 that this was, God was smacking me down, but no, he was preparing me for greater things, right? Far beyond merely going to Yale. Right now, I was speaking to Yale. So, or at least in the name of Yale. So, I wrote the book, and we went back and forth, and I sent her the manuscript. And I'll never forget, I was on 34th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue in Midtown, near where I worked at the time. And I got an email from her, and the email said, we received the manuscript, we reviewed it, we worked on it with the editing commission, the peer review, so on and so forth. Thank you so much for working with us, but we're going to have to say no. Which really hurt, right? So I decided that at that moment I had that, those moments of crisis. If Abi was there, he would give me sage advice. Instead, I gave myself my own advice, which was terrible. I told myself that I would go watch a movie because I didn't know what else to do at this moment, right? Because I was so depressed and downhearted. So I went to the AMC theater on 34th between 8th and 9th, and I decided I would see the first movie that was playing. And the first movie that was playing was, I believe, I, Frankenstein. And so if you were to have been in that movie theater at that time, you would have seen me alone in the theater in the dark crying. Not because my book got rejected, mind you, but because someone had made that movie. Because then I was thinking to myself, nobody wants to publish my book at minimal cost, but millions of dollars have been spent to produce that. So what kind of an unjust and horrible world do we live in that such an awful movie was tested by so many different audiences and produced and released and distributed? Tickets were sold for it, right? The expectation was there that people would spend the price of a book on this movie, right? Not to own it, but to watch it just one time. And nobody would publish my book. And so, once I stopped crying and the movie was over, and incidentally, if you've never seen the movie, you should thank yourself for being kind to yourself. And I realized she was right, because she had said in her email that what you have done is you've written 2 books for the price of 1. You've written a memoir that's trying to be an academic textbook, and you've written an academic textbook that's trying to be a memoir. And it had occurred to me while I was writing that I wanted to tell the story of American Islam as I had experienced it, because I thought that was the surest way to communicate something important. But at the same time, I wanted to tell a story to make sense of something for myself. And when I stepped away from the situation, when I viewed it a little bit more dispassionately, when I thought about it honestly, I realized that she was right, and that there was actually here a choice, that I could go back to the drawing board and I could write this as an academic text, or I could rewrite this as a memoir, and I would have to make a very important decision in that moment. What kind of author did I want to be? What kind of story did I want to tell? What kind of press did I want to work with? And I decided that I wanted to write a memoir, which was not an easy decision for me to make, mind you, because at the time I was a graduate student at Columbia University, and so I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to pursue an academic career, and writing an academic textbook was supposed to be proof that this was the right career choice for me. And it turned out it wasn't. And so I went back to the drawing board and I started rewriting it, and I had probably about 2 years before that submitted an essay for a volume of stories by American Muslim men on intimacy called Shalom Love, which incidentally is also the name of a South Asian matchmaking website. So if you were to search you would get a kick out of this, right? If you were to search Shalom Love the book, you would find Shalom Love the book. But if you just look Shalom Love, it's like profiles where people's aunties make them profiles to get them married. If you're South Asian, it's funnier. The point being that basically someone's trying to get their doctor son married to someone else, right, who's looking for a doctor. And so it's called Shalom Love, which is kind of amazing because it sounds like a Bollywood movie. But anyway, I had written an essay, not for this website, but for an actual book called Shalom Love. And the book was published by Beacon, which is a Unitarian Universalist imprint. And so I reached out to my editor at Beacon and I said, hey, remember me? I wrote that essay for that book named after the matchmaking website. And they said, what? And then I said, never mind, it was an in-joke, they didn't understand. And I said, would you be open to reading something that I'm writing in book length? And they said, sure. And I sent them the manuscript and they said, this is terrible, but we're happy to work with you. And so we ended up rewriting the whole thing from start to finish, probably 14,000 times. And that's the very nice orange book that we have today. Incidentally, I don't know why the cover is orange. I feel like it was a prediction or a warning for a person of color to, I mean, orange, get it? Anyone? Maybe? Someone? Anyone? No one? Nobody? Orange doesn't resonate with anyone here? It's a color. It's a color. It's something that you can't escape. It's something you'll find everywhere. Somebody likes it, you don't know who, but enough people like it because it's everywhere. It's pumpkin spice. It's a joke. Nobody knows what pumpkin spice is. So you know what pumpkin spice is. Thank you, right? That's the book is orange. So yeah, that's the book, and that's the story of how the book got published, and that doesn't really tell you anything about the book, but it's a nice little story that I thought I'd tell you, and now I will tell you something of the genesis of the book and why it is I wrote the book and what it is I was trying to communicate. As I said, and all of this is connected, I went to NYU for college. I started there in the fall of 1998, and that was my first time being in a setting where there were large numbers of Muslims my age. So I grew up in a farm town in New England, very small towns. My high school had about 380 students total, and I think about 380 people lived in my dorm at NYU, so it was kind of a big shift, right? So it was a very, very interesting kind of transition. And when I got to NYU, it was the first time I was around people like myself, and people who came from similar backgrounds ethnically or culturally or religiously, and I found myself overwhelmed by the diversity, but intrigued by the diversity. And I joined what is called the Islamic Center at NYU. It was a Muslim students club. When I was a freshman, we had a tiny little prayer space that probably could fit 15 people in it. It was shaped like an L. It was not a particularly fancy space, and it was very rudimentary and basic. And I think I got there at a time when there were a lot of like-minded students, and this organization started growing by leaps and bounds. And one of the decisions we made, which is really prescient, and we didn't realize the significance of what it is we were doing, is that when we were there as students, and this is sometimes hard for people who don't know Muslim communities to understand, is that there was no institutional Muslim life on campus, right? Everything was run by students and for students. We had a shoestring budget. We didn't have any professional clergy. We didn't have any administrators. We didn't have any permanent space. It was just us, overwhelmingly undergraduates, trying to figure things out. And one of the downsides to figuring things out when you're 19 or 20 years old is, one, that you're 19 or 20 years old, but two, that every 4 years, everyone who's figured everything out leaves, right? There's no institutional memory. So you're constantly reinventing the wheel. And we realized that Fridays, when we had Friday sermons, the congregational prayer service, that we had a problem. We didn't have a regular imam. We had a rotating cast of individuals that came in to give the sermons. And even when they were adequate, they suffered grave shortcomings. Many of them were not from the community, so they didn't know our context. Most of them were not students, and many of them had not been students in the United States. Many of them did not show up on time or know how to speak for the required amount of time, right? They would speak for longer or shorter. Some of them would say ridiculous things. Some of them would say offensive things. Some of them would say things that I'm just happy that this was the pre-9/11 age, that nobody really paid attention to what they were saying. And long story short, we decided among ourselves that we would give the sermons on our own. So here we are, a bunch of 19, 20-year-old kids, and we're going to run a club on our own, and we're going to provide religious services to our community on our own, which seems like a really empowering decision, but it's a kind of crazy decision too, because again, you're very young, you have no life experience, you have no religious training, and you're putting yourself under the microscope. And we did it, and it seemed to work, and I was one of the people who used to give Friday sermons, and I was not a religious leader. I don't think I was particularly a religious individual by any means, but I felt a sense of obligation to my community, a desire to be part of the community, and I felt like I was doing good work. And by senior year, I had been elected president of the Islamic Center, and I remember the day before our first week of classes, me and about 5 or 6 other students printed out these giant posters for our first event of the semester, where, like any good college religious organization, we were advertising free food, right? The religious content was incidental, right? Like at the bottom, right? Like nobody really cared. We just wanted you to come and get food. And we snuck into every dorm on NYU campus, putting up flyers everywhere, like on the inside of the elevators, in the fire escapes, right? Like everywhere you could imagine you could put a poster, we had put a poster. We spent probably 80% of our budget on posters. And we were very excited because in the last 3 years, we had seen our organization undergo a remarkable transformation. When I came in as a freshman, the Islamic Center at NYU was this tiny little student club of, like I said, 15, 20 students with very few activities. And by my junior year, it had become the most active student organization on campus out of 50,000 students. No other organization held as many events annually as ours did, which was remarkable because we were doing this without staff, without any professional support, with a shoestring budget. It was all us and basically not studying for classes, right? Basically doing anything we could other than what our parents were actually paying for us to do. And the first week of classes went pretty well. We were kind of getting everything in motion. And I remember that the second week of classes was when our first big event was going to happen. And that turned out to be 9/11. And so the very morning when we had expected our fellow NYU students to wake up and see our posters everywhere inviting them to come to the Islamic Center at NYU, they were instead staring at TV screens watching an endless replay of planes striking towers and tearing them down. For those of you who were in New York or know anyone in New York, it was obviously an incredibly traumatic and difficult day. And for us even more so because we felt, on the one hand, just as scared and confused as anyone else, and added to that the confusion of whether or not we would be held responsible and how we were supposed to respond to this moment. And for me, the response of the moment was particularly challenging because I had found myself and put myself in a position of being now the spokesperson for the largest substantial Muslim community within proximity to Ground Zero, at least the only one that had any kind of media outreach or media presence. And so I don't know what it is actually I had wanted to do with myself prior to 9/11. I told myself I wanted to be a lawyer, but that's probably because I wasn't very creative. My parents were Pakistani. If you're not going to be a doctor, maybe you should be a lawyer. It's like, you know, even that's like a little bit scandalous, but back then it was kind of acceptable, maybe not. I don't know. Sahel, what do you think? Like, kind of, sort of. Like, if you can get a 5 series, you're socially acceptable. If not, it's fine. It's true. It's okay. There's no judgments involved. In conclusion, I'm not socially acceptable. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. I really had no idea. I was very active in Muslim student life. Had things gone differently, I have no idea where I would have taken my energy or my passion, but as it was, I found myself suddenly, at the age of 21, at the center of what felt like the most important conversations in the universe. And many times I would find myself on stage with a minister or a rabbi or a priest on some sort of interfaith panel or interfaith discussion. And again, I'm 21 years old, right? So as earnestly as I am in that situation, as eager as I am to speak or represent in that situation, I have no preparation or life experience for what it is I'm being asked to do, and no ability to really understand whether the things I'm saying are actually making any kind of positive impact on the world around me. And I pretty much fell into this role believing that, that my job was to be a professional Muslim, that my life was supposed to be about explaining Islam to the rest of the world, one, in order to answer and meet the curiosities and concerns of people outside my community, and two, in order to empower and defend and strengthen my own community. And I did this for years and years and years. And I would say that I think my life kind of fell into three phases from 9/11 onwards. The first, this phase, was the condemn phase, where I condemned anything and everything that had to do with Islam that was negative. Because 99% of the interviews that I was called to appear on, 99% of the events or programs, were always some sort of ritual condemnation, right? Nobody really cared what I thought. Nobody really cared what my ideas were or my insights were. I was simply expected to be there in order to assure people that there were Muslims who knew that bad things in the name of Islam were still bad. So basically my entire life was condemn, right? Like I had become a human press release. It was very exciting. I did this over and over again because I believed it was the right thing to do. And many Muslims I talked to believe that that's all their communities ever expected to do, and many of them who are in positions of leadership feel, and sometimes not without good reason, that that's all they're ever asked to do. That their entire presence in the public sphere is merely to tell people that they are bad, or that there is something wrong with them, or that they have a problem, but that they are ready and willing to solve that problem, right? So it's basically like you're basically becoming the non-model minority, right? So that was the phase that I found myself in, and I told myself that I was doing this for the right reason. Why else would I have been in that situation in that moment in time, right? Why else would I have ended up as president of the Islamic Center at NYU at that moment in time, when there were all these other students who could have had that position, but the one who was interested in media, the one who was doing Middle Eastern studies, the one who was comfortable in public speaking roles, was the one who was in that position. So I told myself, and it's funny how religiously, right, we can tell ourselves spiritually, ethically, however you want to look at it, that where we are is where we are meant to be. And there is a higher purpose or greater reason for where it is we're supposed to be. And you can imagine how this ended, right? Like not very well, right? Because I did this for years and years and years until I completely and totally burned out. Like completely and totally burned out. Because what I threw myself into was this incredibly negative, soul-destroying work. And I'll give you a simple example of this. When I was 31, so 10 years after the attacks, I found myself working in Washington, D.C., living not far from here, working for a think tank that worked on policy questions related to Islam, the Muslim world, and United States foreign policy and national security. So I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, that the years and years and years and years of work I had put in condemning and explaining and justifying and going on TV and writing op-eds and appearing on interfaith panels had led me to where I was supposed to be, which is a position where I could finally actually bring some value to conversations where my identity was constantly invoked but rarely represented. Does that make sense? Right? Like I was finally going to be in a place where instead of just telling people what was bad, I was going to be able to tell people what it is we were supposed to be doing. Right? So yes, extremism is bad, but what else? And I remember being invited to a backdoor conversation around the Iran deal. So this was about, I want to say about 8 years ago, roughly, 7 years ago. And this was during the Obama administration, right? So it was a good time to be a Muslim working in national security because the president was Muslim. So it was like I was making sure you were awake, right? Someone in the back was very concerned. It's like, this changes everything. So, you know, this was when the Iran deal was very nebulous, right? It was sort of like the Democratic Party and the Obama administration are putting out feelers. And so they brought in like policy wonks and people to talk about, shall we say, you know, whether or not there should be an Iran deal. And I remember being at one such panel, and there were about 20 people in a room, and I was the only brown person. I was, as far as I know, the only Muslim. And I was, you know, at least biologically speaking, the person closest to the Middle East in terms of history of recent evolution, right? So I'm not Middle Eastern, but, you know, like close. I'm regularly confused for a Middle Easterner, right, at airports and other public places. Incidentally, if you ever want to fly anywhere, I am happy to charge a modest fee to fly with you because no one will sit next to me on the plane. I can save you the best seat on Southwest. I found this out. This is amazing, right? So this is one of the perks of like unsubtle racism. You know how Southwest has open seating, right? Like on Southwest, there's no reserved seats, right? So one thing you can do to screw up everything for everyone is take the middle seat, right? So like if you're A, right, just take the middle seat, nobody knows what to do. Because logically, like if you this is how Trump wins, right? Like he just does the craziest thing possible, and then you don't know what to do because you're like, well, a rational human being would never do that, right? So you spend all your time trying to make sense of it, and the next thing you know, there's a huge tax cut. So what happened is normally people get on the plane, they take the aisle seat or the window seat, right? Like if you have priority, those are one of the two seats that people want is the aisle or the window. And so what I do is I take the middle seat because it just throws everyone off because they're like, what kind of crazy person would take the middle seat, right? Who wants the middle seat? So then they assume that either like one, you're crazy, right? Or two, you're saving the seat for anyone else, right? Maybe you're saving a seat for someone else. But ultimately, nobody wants to sit next to the large brown guy, right? So it's like a nice feeling. So I actually end up getting the whole row, right? So sometimes Islamophobia is not a bad thing, right? Like it's a Goldilocks Islamophobia. If there's too much Islamophobia, I won't get on the plane, right? But if there's just enough Islamophobia, I will have gotten on the plane, but then I'll have a row to myself, right? And then people kind of look over me and they're like, that's weird. We thought he was sitting next to someone. Or like, but we don't want to engage the strange foreign guy in a conversation. So suffice to say, basically there was 20 people in a room and then there was me. And we were having this conversation about whether or not there should be an Iran deal. And there was one particularly, shall we say, hawkish individual in the room who's not only rejecting the idea of an Iran deal, but wanted us to go to war with Iran. And I found this to be a really problematic line of reasoning because he didn't really seem to be thinking it through, right? He was speaking purely, almost reflexively out of his desire to inflict harm, right? I never heard out of his mouth like, this is the better thing to do, or this is why we have to do this. It wasn't even this like, a feigned, even if it insincere, but still at least vocalized expression of, well, I don't want to do this, but we have to do this, right? It was kind of like, I'm ready to do this, right? As if, incidentally, this person has never served in the military, right? Which is, I think, kind of par for the course. So anyway, we went back and forth, and then I finally spoke up, and I said to him, I think that the idea of a war with Iran isn't perhaps that well thought out. And, we went back and forth, and I pointed out to him that the Iraq War had gone south very quickly and that it had led to the deaths of something on the order of almost 1 million people, right? And it had been an absolute disaster, and that Iran was 3 times the size in population and probably 3 times the size in geography, and that if the war is too successful, as in if we win, as if we overthrow the administration, it could make what happened in Iraq look like a cakewalk. And I'll never forget, he looked me he just looked dead at me and he said, I'm okay with that. And this is someone who you've probably seen on TV dozens of times, right? He's like respectable opinion, right? Like pundit and policymaker and influential politico, and said, I can sleep at night because it's not my fault. And I was very confused, and I was confused for 2 reasons. One was because I thought that was my trump card. Like usually you think that when you invoke the deaths of large numbers of people, you should have won the argument, right? But like it was like, oh, and I was like, now I don't have an argument left, right? And 2, I noticed very quickly that he was dismissing everything I was saying because he assumed I was saying everything I was saying because of where I came from. He never actually stopped to think that maybe I had sincere intentions and motivations, that maybe I genuinely disagreed with him on policy, but that my reasons for disagreeing are grounded in fact. He assumed that because I was brown and Muslim, I must secretly be some sort of Iranian double agent, right? And he was looking at Iran the whole time. Nobody was looking at Russia, but no comment. So, can I say that? I don't think I can say. I don't know. It's like I'm gonna and more. Oh my God, I'm never getting on Southwest again. So. Anyway, that's when I realized, and I think I kind of had this moment of falling apart, that all this work and energy I had invested, what did I really get out of it? Right? I'd put 10 years of my life into this, and I'd walked into the room, and I was in the room, and I encountered 2 things, right? One was, in many cases, this kind of naked aggression that I found deeply revolting and confusing because I had been told the last 10 years that my entire existence as a Muslim was to condemn exactly that kind of mentality. And here I was in positions of, or at least spaces of influence, hearing the exact same mentality, right, without any sort of regret or apology or condemnation. And the second thing that I got out of it was this feeling that would I ever be taken seriously except as a person of the faith and color that I had? Would I ever be listened to for what it is I was trying to say? And so the second phase that kind of grew out of that is the phase of what I'll call exhaustion, where I think I completely checked out of everything. And my life entirely fell apart, and that's a big part of what the book is about. And suffice it to say, when I told you about this anecdote, I was 31, I was married, I had a really good job, I was living in a really nice neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia. I had not made it by my father's doctor standards, but I was living a good life. I was probably in the 1%, which is kind of terrifying to think about, but such as income inequality in America. And by any measure, if you sit there and you think to yourself, if this is me at 31, obviously you're going to ask yourself, where am I going to be at 41, right? Like, life was going really, really well. By the time I was 32, I was divorced. I had lost my job. I lost all my savings. I had lost my health. I had lost my apartment and my car. And if not for family members who incidentally did not live in the United States, I probably would have been homeless. And so my life went through this complete collapse that was extremely hard for me to make sense of. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I wanted to make sense of it. And so, and I'll end in just a few minutes and take questions. One of the reasons why I wanted to tell this story, and one of the reasons why I chose the title How to Be a Muslim, is because I feel like the conversation on Islam and being Muslim is such a narrow one, and does such a disservice to what people actually experience in their everyday lives, and what it means to live with a religious tradition and a religious faith. I'll say a few things about that, and then I think we can go for questions. The first is, the title of the book is tongue-in-cheek, right? How to be a Muslim. It's not literally a how-to manual, but sometimes algorithms are amazing, right? How many of you buy books on Amazon? Right? Shame on you. All of you are terrible human beings, right? Your local communities are dying because of you. No, I'm just kidding. So, when you go on Amazon, they do this thing where they're like, people who buy this product also buy, right? They have the recommendation engine, so they're like bundle, right? So I would like to think that my book is like a pretty raw, honest exploration of like a very difficult time in my life and in our country's life. And for the first 3 or 4 months, the book most often bought with my book was like A is for Allah, right? Like a children's book, right? Because probably some parents were sitting somewhere and be like, how do I make sure my son is a Muslim? And they're like, oh, how to be a Muslim. Like, this looks great, right? Like, they don't read, they're clearly not reading the summary of what the book is actually about. They're like, oh, it's nice and it's orange, right? So they're like, let's just buy this, right? And they buy the book, and then one day they read the book and they're like, oh, dear God. And then they call all their Muslim friends, right? And then, suddenly, and so now if you go on Amazon, the book most often bought with my book is Hillbilly Elegy, right? Which is such a huge, remarkable, how did that happen, right? One book is about the disaster unfolding in the Appalachians, right? And sort of how social breakdown happens under society's disinterest, I guess. And then the first is some children's book. And I think part of that is because people actually started reading the book, but I don't care because they bought the book. See, all of this is connected, right? I don't care what you do with the book, as long as you recommend it, you buy it, and so on and so forth. Incidentally, Amazon briefly had my book on sale, the Kindle edition, for $2.99. Which is amazing because that means that my whole life is worth $2.99, right? My book is basically worth one-way ride on the New York City Metro, right? That's kind of amazing. The second thing about writing a book is that you realize that if you're Pakistani, nothing you do will ever be good enough. My father turned to me once, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and said, I heard you're writing a book. He did not say this with enthusiasm. He was kind of like, oh, here's another reason you want to be a doctor. So I was like, yeah. He's like, okay. That was it. It's the end of the conversation. Maybe a year later, he just turns to me. He's like, where's your book? And I was like, writers get very defensive, right? Because we're the laziest people in the world, but we have to we're in process, and we're hearing voices and things like that. So I was like, oh, I'm working on it. It takes a long time to write a book. And he looks at me straight in the face. He's like, Bill Clinton's book got published in 6 months. And this is incidentally, this is How to Be Pakistani. This is this 2-second anecdote. So I said, Bill Clinton was president of the United States of America. He could probably write whatever he wants and get published. You know what my father said? Why can't you be president? So that is actually what it is like to be Pakistani. Can I throw some water on Khizr Khan? You know Khizr Khan, right? You know Khizr Khan, the guy who gave Donald Trump a heart attack. You remember the speech he gave where he waved the Constitution, right? everyone was like, oh my God, Khizr Khan's amazing. He like challenged Donald Trump. I challenge any person here who is like brown or a child of immigrants. All Khizr Khan did is say to Donald Trump what every brown parent says to their kid every day. You have sacrificed nothing. You have sacrificed no one. You're a fool. You don't know anything. And then you just wave a book, whether it's the Quran or the Constitution. And that's the definition of white privilege. Every brown kid in America hears that speech every night and functions as a normal human being. There's like a deep hole and sadness in our heart every day because we realize we were failures, right? But we function, right? Donald Trump heard that once and he lost his mind, right? Like one day someone told him that he had sacrificed nothing and no one and that he had a black soul, and this man lost his mind, right? Like he literally just went insane, right? That's the definition of white privilege. That is the greatest definition of white privilege you will ever need. That's not to take anything away from Khizr Khan. He's amazing. He and I are both Muslim and bald. But other than that, he's an amazing human being, so you should read his book. And the final point is, one of the hopes in writing this book, and I'm not blind to the fact that had Hillary Clinton, won the popular vote and been elected, that my book would not be as popular as it is. Because this is a political moment in which talking about Muslims and Islam is a very powerful moment. And Phil Klinkner found that the single question that is most predictive of whether or not someone voted for Clinton or Trump, does anyone know this question? There's a question that you can ask someone, the most predictive of which way they went in the election is whether or not they thought Barack Obama was a Muslim. Which is amazing, right? That question is more likely than any other question to tell you where someone voted in 2016. Which is remarkable, especially if you are a Muslim, because here you are, 1% of the country, right? There's about 3, 4, maybe 5 million Muslims in the United States, but probably not. And we have basically become this political football around which it sometimes feels like the fate of Western civilization will be decided, right? What you think about Muslims tells a person a lot about what you think about pretty much everything in the world. And so one of my hopes in writing this book was to start a conversation about Muslims, by Muslims, that actually explores the challenge and difficulty of what it is to be a minority in this moment in the United States. And what I'll end with this and hopefully leave you with is something of the importance of the present moment. I don't think I realized quite how strange this moment would feel. When Trump first proposed his Muslim ban, if you remember way back during the campaign, I actually remember I called a friend of mine in London and I asked him, and no filter here, I said, should I leave? And he was quiet and he's like, I don't know. And I said, I'm not joking, because it's deeply alarming, right? Like I know enough history that when you're picking on a minority and you start saying things like they shouldn't be allowed to enter or to leave, like where does that language go? Now there's a 99% chance it doesn't go anywhere, but you don't want to be in that 1% chance that it does go somewhere, right? That doesn't seem like a very smart place to be. So I asked him and he said, I honestly don't know. I asked an Israeli colleague of mine and I said to him, what would you do if you were in our situation? And his father was a survivor, right? His father survived the Holocaust and he was very quiet and I said, I want you to answer me honestly. And he said, I would pack my bags, but I wouldn't leave. That's okay. And when Charlottesville happened, not so many months ago, it occurred to me that there's something very unique about this moment, that this kind of hate has existed in the United States since the United States has existed. But what's unique about this hate and this moment is that different from the last 2 decades, it's not coming from the outsides in, it's not coming from the bottom up, it's also coming from the top down. And that's what makes this moment so unnerving, is that the narrative we've had of ourselves as a country, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, is that we are on the right side of these conversations. So our political leadership has been on the right side. And so sometimes we as a society have been slower to get ourselves to where we need to be, but we have made the right decisions in part because we have had leaders, on multiple levels who have been willing to make the right decisions morally, politically, ethically. And given that right now in this moment, it doesn't seem like that pertains in quite the same way, it feels like those of us in this room, people who are minorities, people of conscience, people who are paying attention to what's happening, we actually have the ability to affect the future of this country in a pretty remarkable way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Haroon, for that very engaging presentation and sharing things that I feel will provoke some questions from you. If you have a question, Katie is waiting with a basket to gather those and then pass it along to us, and then we'll hand them over to Haroon to be able to address them. So people have questions, please pass them on to your neighbor and to the aisle so that they can be collected, or if you need extra cards, do let us know. You have questions? So while we wait for some questions, the piece you touched on towards the end, Haroon, about hate, how it's been pretty much a part of our fabric since this nation's inception. And yet it is different now, the texture and the way in which it is manifest and how we are feeling that. Also, when I look at it in the context of our being a more pluralistic and multicultural society, it seems more pronounced in ways that points to an ancient fear. You know, while hospitality is an ancient religious virtue, discrimination is an ancient vice as well. My question is, how do we, and the we is communities, especially communities of faith, in this kind of a climate, figure out ways to engage that hate and move us in the way we need to be in right relationship? Is that? Go ahead.
So first of all, you can ask me anything you want. I won't be offended. I spoke at the 9/11 Museum about 2 months ago, and I received a number of death threats, and the museum did as well, because my book is called How to Be a Muslim. So I was talking about the book, so I think people assumed that I was going to go to the 9/11 Museum and tell people to be Muslim, which is kind of interesting, right? Because they clearly did not read the book, nor avail themselves of the public library. So the room, you know, it was in the conference room at the 9/11 Museum, and there were probably about 30 or 40 police officers, both in the room and then outside, lining the path from the entrance into the venue, and they were sort of prepared for the worst. And the president of the museum actually delivered a very powerful statement about the importance of fighting hate, as Abi said, in this moment, and the sort of the tradition in the United States of standing up against bigotry and intolerance, which for someone who, in her position, you know, as head of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, which is a national institution of tremendous significance, was a very big deal. And so towards the end of the event, and it was a great event, you know, the moderator said, you know, we have time for one last question. And you can imagine, this is why I think people are amazing, and why we should open our hearts and minds to everyone, because people are just amazing. So you imagine you're in the setting, and there's like police officers everywhere, and the moderator says you have time for one last question. You imagine to yourself, right, like what could that last question be? Right, and you would think to yourself that if I have a question, I should probably ask myself, is my question worth asking in this venue, in this moment? The last question was, how tall are you? Which was amazing, right? It was incredible. It was like, wow, I want to go through life as you, right? Because this person sees the good in everything, right? She'd be like, it's true that the planet is drowning, but how tall is the ocean? So it was kind of an amazing moment. I was very excited. But I'm actually going to answer your question. One of the really challenging parts of this moment for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, is what are we facing right now? Right? Because the answer to that question determines whether our response is incorrect or correct. Are we facing a momentary burst in xenophobia and intolerance that will fade away in 4 to 8 years? Or was the last 30 or 40 years actually the aberration? And are we going back to how things used to be? And are we going to have to acclimatize ourselves to a very long-term conflict, right? Where we thought the direction of the country was one, and it's actually another, right? And so the way I respond to this is when people ask me, is I say, at some level, I don't know that it necessarily matters if we know what it is. I think what matters is how we kind of engage around this. And I'll give you two kind of anecdotes that always speak to me very powerfully in this moment. The first is, how many people here, I don't know if any of you have seen this show, but it's a show called Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. You ever heard of this show by Tina Fey? Yes, you have, right? It's a funny show, it's a comedy, it's on Netflix. The show makes fun of, very humorously I should add, of pretty much every demographic in America. But the show only makes fun of, as in has nothing positive to say about, Midwestern white Christians. Do you follow me? Right? Like, there are ridiculous Muslim characters in the show, but they're sort of, you kind of laugh at them and with them, right? There's ridiculous New York tropes and stereotypes, right? Like, every kind of person you can imagine is on the show in a sort of ridiculous, way, and it's funny and this and that. But the one negative demographic, the consistently negative demographic, is the Midwestern white Christian. And it occurred to me that, if I was a Midwestern white Christian watching the show, how would I respond to that? And so I do think that how we treat people, has a major impact on whether or not they actually listen to what it is we have to say. Whether they agree with us or not, I think that's part of it. And the second is actually connected to that, is that no one can actually hear anything you have to say if they don't trust you. And they're not going to trust you if they don't know you. And so one of the things I do in my work that earns me only a small amount of grief is I work on Muslim-Jewish relations, and part of the work, and this is how I got to know David, is I take Muslim leaders to Jerusalem to study with Israeli scholars. And it's not a sort of like let's all become friends program, it's let's learn to understand each other's narratives in order to promote healthier forms of disagreement. Make sense? Right? That's a big difference. It's not to say you don't need to agree with each other. We need to learn how to disagree with each other. And one of the things that I found remarkable, and speaking to you in work in Muslim communities, is some Muslims I talk to think the work is great. Some Muslims think the work is completely irrelevant. But some Muslims I talk to are really confused as to why American Muslims should work with American Jews. And on more than one occasion, and more than probably a dozen occasions, I've met American Muslims, well-educated, civically engaged, who have asked me why we should work with American Jews when American Jews hate Muslims. And I remember asking them, well, why would you say that? And not out of a sense of you're ridiculous, but I just want to understand. And on all of these occasions, these individuals told me, well, the overwhelming majority of American Jews voted for Donald Trump. And he wants to destroy our community. Exactly. Who said what? What? Right? And I was like, that's funny because 80% of American Jews voted for Hillary Clinton, right? And the best statistic is 87% of American Muslims voted for Hillary Clinton, right? I don't know what the other 13% were doing. They probably didn't understand how the machine worked. They were like, oh my God, I'm going to screw this up. So that's actually what happened in Michigan. They're like, what is happening? And the reason is, and this is so interesting, and so I asked someone, and I said, well, why would you say that? And he said, well, Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel, and he constantly calls himself the leader of the Jews, and he loves Trump. And I said to myself, that's funny, because that happens to me all the time, where people will say, I remember I went to a dinner party recently with major American CEOs. I was by far, I was probably, my total value, the total value of all my assets was probably less than the amount of money that the people around the table had spent on their clothes that evening, right? So one of them asked me with genuine surprise, he even asked me, just kind of expressed with surprise, your mom was educated? And I was like, she was an oncologist, right? She was a doctor. He's like, wow, that's amazing. I was like, why is that amazing, right? Like, what did you think? Like, you know, and it was so interesting to me. But the reason I say that is because many times when I go to programs, you know, people will sort of say, well, how can that be true? Because people in Saudi Arabia do this. And I'm like, I am not the government of Saudi Arabia, right? Like and this strikes people by surprise. They're like, but you were a Muslim, and so are the people in the government of Saudi Arabia. And I'm like, well, that's great, right? That's amazing, right? And people in every community do this to other communities because they don't have interlocutors who can explain things to them. And if you don't have relationships with people based on trust or openness, then it's easy to become caricatured. And if I think that another community is out to harm me, I'm not just disinterested in their narrative. I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect myself from them. And so I think that there's a lot to be said in this moment for trying to go beyond our comfort zones and at least listening to or engaging and challenging the narratives that people might have of us. And that's not easy work. It can be very frustrating work, but hopefully that's something of an answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, now we're going to share the stage. We're going to do a comedy routine.
We'll do that.
So,
That's right. That's right.
do you like my sneakers? They're from California. They're amazing, right?
And they're warm.
The sneakers are not actually that warm, actually. I just realized that when I got out of the plane.
Oh, shame.
Yeah.
Nor is your head, sadly. Yeah.
No, it's not. It's not.
Could you comment, Haroon, on how being a Muslim deepens and sustains your engagement with the world?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I'm going to skip it because I never thought of that. The worst is when people ask you really good questions. Like someone asked me I was in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. And someone asked me, this is terrible because it's like, I'm a writer, was like, which fictional character do you most identify with? And I was like, oh God. I was like, Eli Manning. Ouch, I'm sorry. I'm from New York, it's okay. You know, I guess one of the most interesting things, and I'll say this, and I'm sure everyone here has an experience like this, is for me, you know, when my life fell apart at the age of 31, I don't know who asked the question, so I'm just going to randomly look around the room. When my life fell apart at the age of 31, that was the first moment where I actually had to ask myself what it meant to be Muslim. Because it's very easy to have a sense of your identity when things are going your way, right? And when things in your life don't go the way that you think they're supposed to, suddenly you ask yourself, what is the purpose of your life? And it's a very disheartening, disquieting moment when you realize your life is not going the way that you thought it was supposed to go. And then you realize with some small degree of horror that it may never go the way that you thought it was supposed to go. And so you have to find some resources to make sense of that. And I remember reading a column by Ross Douthat. I never get his name right. Do you know how to pronounce his last name? You know Ross Douthat, the New York Times conservative columnist of the New York Times. And he had this amazing piece where he commented on the rise in mortality rates among whites in America and why whites were now dying at and I'm going to screw up the statistical terminology, but their rates of death were increasing faster than for any other demographic in the United States. And he made a cultural argument about this. And he said, you know, for minority populations in America, it's kind of funny. He didn't mean it in a jerky way, so I don't want it to be interpreted that way. He said, you know, you're kind of used to getting the short end of the stick, right? Like you have already internalized and accepted that things will not work out for you, right? Like someone will have told you in the process of your growing up, right? That like society is not built around you and your concerns, right? So you will be lucky if you make it, you know, so hence the much maligned sort of comment that some minorities have is that you have to work twice as hard, right? Which Ta-Nehisi Coates, the popular pundit, commentator, philosopher, wrote, it just means that you get half as much, right? So you work twice as hard, and you could look the other way to say you get half as much, right? Where Ross Douthat said that for a lot of Americans, white Americans, there's no safety net. Because if you were raised to believe that the world was going to go your way, you have no spiritual or intellectual or cultural or social tools to catch you, so to speak, when you start falling. Because you were never supposed to fall. And for me, I think religion came in and my relationship to religion fundamentally changed in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's very much a work in progress, when I realized that life was not going to go the way that I thought it was supposed to go. And God bless my parents, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense at all, but I was raised with a very kind of suburban bourgeois ethic of achievement, right? My parents were doctors, they were upper middle class, I was supposed to be upper middle class, and that's a great ambition, especially if you come as an immigrant from a condition of poverty. It's a remarkable achievement, but the assumption is that's where I would end up, and when I didn't end up there, it was like, oh, that's what I thought my whole life was gonna be. And what was religion supposed to do in that? And so I think for me very much now is this sense of that there are values in the world that transcend your material outcome, which sounds so cliche at some level, but until you actually experience it and have to come to terms with it, I think it's a very different thing. Yeah.
This may be a related question. As a Muslim in America today, at what point do we need to leave? What is the triggering event, or do we stay and try to change things, and if so, how?
At what point do we need to leave? I actually was having this conversation in Palo Alto with a tech guy who probably is a multimillionaire, who made himself a lot of money in tech with a company you've probably heard of. And he was having this very same conversation with a group of us. At what point do you leave? And his answer, and then I'll give you my answer. His answer was, when you can no longer get a job. He's like, when you sit down at a job interview and who you are prevents you from getting a job, that is a sign that we have crossed a certain kind of line. And it might be nice to think you can stick around and fight it, but you're not going to win it. That was his answer. What he didn't really kind of help us out with is, where are you going to go, right? Like, okay, Mr. Tech Millionaire, that's a great idea, right? Like, where am I gonna go, right? Like, what is the skill set for how to be a Muslim writer? My plan is to go to Canada every 3 months on vacation, and then on one of those vacations, I'm just gonna be like, oops, I lost my passport. I will say that when Trump was elected, and I thought he was gonna win for a long time, and it still didn't prepare me for what it felt like when he won. It did not feel good. It kind of felt like an anxiety attack and heartburn at the same time, right? And it's kind of felt like that at the same time. It's like an alternating, it's like Tums and Xanax. It's like a little bit of that, like, it's an interesting image. I want you to keep that image in your mind. Like, who should we run in 2020, Tums or Xanax? So, and on that answer, everything depends. So, I thought he would go slowly, right? Like, I thought that he would move very slowly, and that this Muslim ban stuff would happen like 2 or 3 years down the line. And lo and behold, it was like day 4 of his in office, and it was like, hey, let's ban some Muslims, right? And I remember it was a Saturday morning, and I was like, at that point, I think I was heartbroken, because it felt to me like the country had voted me off the island. And it was like, I mean, okay, I live in New York City, so chances are, probably most people around me did not vote me off the island, but like collectively speaking, the country had decided that I didn't matter. And not only that I didn't matter, that I was actually bad for the country and should leave the country, or be made to leave the country. That's what it felt like. And when the ban happened and the chaos happened at the airports, I remember just feeling absolutely shattered, paralyzed, thinking to myself, like, it's actually happening. And I was an idiot for thinking that it couldn't happen. And I knew it was going to happen, and I did nothing about it. Or I didn't do enough about it. And I remember I closed my computer, I stopped watching the news, I kind of just stared out the window uselessly. I probably played Candy Crush for 3 hours, because what do we do when faced with creeping authoritarianism? We play Candy Crush. And then a friend of mine texted me and said, turn on the news, which means go on Twitter. And one day no one's going to know what turn on the news means, so I have to translate these things, right? A friend of mine said, go on Twitter. And hundreds and then thousands of people had started showing up at airports across the country spontaneously. I mean, there were networks that were organized. I don't mean it just like happened out of nowhere, but it wasn't like telegraphed in advance, to push back. And I can't explain to you what that felt like. But on the one hand, it gave me a lot of hope. Now, on the other, and I'll never forget this, I don't recall, and I could be wrong, I don't recall a single word of protest from a single leader of a Muslim-majority country. Like, you would think that if the President of the United States is mooting a ban on your religion, that people in positions of political influence who share that religion would have something to say. And there was almost nothing. And it was like everyday Americans, most of whom probably don't even know a Muslim, who came out and pushed back and actually got it shut down. And obviously that doesn't mean that that has solved all the problems or fixed the problem or anything like that, but it indicated that like I was not alone in that moment. And so for me, pushing back requires, one, having the audacity to act, two, remember that you're not alone, and three, and most importantly, maintain a sense of humor. Because the greatest weapon in the face of arrogance and power is comedy. Because as long as you can laugh at someone, they can't scare you. And if you let them scare you, you let them win. And so I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the geniuses who came up with the best political signs of the past year or so, right? Like at the airport protest, there was a young woman, I believe in Chicago, who had a sign, and it said, "We gave you hummus, show us some respect," which was the greatest thing ever. And then at a protest around this, some guy had held up a sign. It said, "Keep your hands off my halal guy," which was amazing. Another guy spontaneously had "Leave my halal guy alone." And then one guy had a sign that said, "Do what you believe in," and another guy next to it had a sign that said "Trains." And I don't know what that meant, but it was amazing.
And I recall fondly and with a sense of real awe, actually, how funny and cutting and on point you and Wajahat Ali were on CNN after you recovered from the Candy Crush obsession and got on TV. It was really powerful. It was powerful pushback, and many of us are very grateful for what you were able to say in those really difficult times. Turning it around a little bit, what are the top 6 things, and it can only be 6, what are the top 6 things that we should know about Islam?
Oh, wow. Top 6 things that you should know about Islam.
You can fudge the numbers a bit.
I can fudge the numbers a bit. Yeah. These are good questions. Yeah. This is an amazing crowd. Thank you for making I just got off a plane. I don't know what time zone I'm on. I was hoping for questions like, why does Islam hate women? Like, that's easy, right? And then this is like, I have to think about these. Top 6 things people should know about Islam. I mean, wow, religiously, politically, ethnically, culturally. Okay, I'll say a couple of things that I find so endlessly interesting about Islam in America, and maybe that's something of an answer. The first is, the first Muslim in North America that we have records of was half Dutch, half Spanish, son of a pirate. Can't even make this stuff up. I'm not even kidding. This is amazing, because I'm writing a book about this, so I'll just tell you this because it's kind of fun. So apparently, the 4 most common Dutch names in the 17th century for boys included Jan and Cornelius, or Cornelis, which was abbreviated into Jan and Kees. And so, you know how we use the expression so-and-so, or every Tom, Dick, and Harry? The expression in the 17th century was every Jan and Kees, or Jan Kees, which became Yankees. Interestingly enough, that's one fun thing. Second is, many of the Muslims who were forced out with the Jews from Spain made common cause with Dutch Protestants who were also under Spanish rule. And so there was this alliance between Dutch rebels and Spanish Muslim and Spanish Jewish rebels, including pirates. And so there was a Dutch nobleman, Jan Som, who converted to Islam, moved to Morocco, was elected governor of a city called Salah at the time, which is now Rabat, and served as governor and head of this pirate navy. He took the name Murat Rais, or Captain Murat. He married a Spanish Muslim noblewoman and had a son named Anthony. Anthony actually left Morocco and came to New Amsterdam because it was Dutch, and became a very wealthy businessman and landowner, and founded Coney Island, Brooklyn, as well as Gravesend, Brooklyn. And one of the reasons why he founded these neighborhoods in Brooklyn is that when he came to New Amsterdam, he didn't really fit in, principally because he was not actually Christian. And so attendance at church services was mandatory, and he would often fall asleep during church services. And then when people would try to wake him up, he would often respond by punching him in the face. Unfortunately, validating every stereotype of Muslims we've ever had. So unfortunately, like, Anthony was not the nicest person from a PR point of view. But they kind of came up with this, like, well, he's like really wealthy and he's like a good businessman, but he punches people in the face, so we don't really know what to do with him. So like, why don't you go to Brooklyn, and you can be like close enough that we can like tax you, but far enough that you can't punch us in the face. So he ended up in Brooklyn. And actually, he married a Dutch woman, and they had 4 daughters, I believe. He was buried somewhere near Wall Street. His grave is now lost to us. But his descendants married into the Vanderbilts and some prominent families before kind of just fading away, right? That's just kind of a neat story that has absolutely nothing to do with anything.
So Haroon, that's one.
Oh my God, that's not one. Okay, 1 is the Dutch thing, 2 is the pirate thing. 3, that's kind of crazy that nobody noticed about the story. Did you hear what I said? He was elected governor of Rabat, right? So there were city-states in North Africa that were mostly Muslim in the 1500s and 1600s that elected their governments, which most people don't know, because this was about 150, 200 years before the French and American revolutions, and they had elections, which is kind of crazy, which indicates that the idea of elected governments was far more widespread and contentious than we believe it was. So that's 3 things. The 4th thing I would say is that American Muslims, if we were a country, which we might be if we're all deported, if we were a country, we would be in the top 10 wealthiest Muslim countries in the world, which is crazy, because that includes like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and very, very wealthy countries. There's a lot of money in the American Muslim community. It's just not always used very well, or shall we say, up to its potential. If you look at religious groups in the United States by gender disparity in pay, the most gender equal community by salary in the United States is the American Muslim community, right? So you know how women in America make 77 cents roughly on the dollar to the man kind of thing, right? It's 55 for Latino women? Well, there you go. If you break it by religion, I don't know why this is exactly, there's a lot of demographic things, but it usually blows people's minds, because oftentimes I'm in a room where people are like, oh my God, your mom speaks English. And I'm like, yes, thank you. So that's always like a fun one to kind of throw out there. And American Islam is very interesting because it is the only Western Muslim community, so to speak, that has a significant proportion of the population that is, for lack of a better term, indigenous, as in African American Muslims, right? So Muslims in Canada, elsewhere, right, they're not huge communities of like deep-rooted, long-standing local communities of Muslims, but American Islam has that. And finally, Barack Obama is Muslim. Yes. This is live streamed, right? Thank you.
How do your Pakistani parents, or I'll specify, how does your Pakistani dad, what does he say about your achievements now? And the questioner notes, I, as a Desi parent, applaud your daringness and your work.
Thank you, anonymous Desi parent. There's probably like 1 of 3 people in the room, but good job at staying anonymous. So I'm very lucky in that my parents, especially my mom, but not only my mom, were very supportive of education, but were not particularly insistent on me following a specific career track. My father would have preferred that I become a doctor. In retrospect, it probably would have meant I would have had health insurance for most of my life, but that's okay. But they were never like, oh, if you're not a doctor, we're going to disown you. So that was kind of cool. As I go older, I actually look back on it and I think that, a lot of the things they told me at the time sometimes felt like insane. Like, why can't you be president? is like, can you like not crush me with like every pressure in the universe? But actually, at the same time, was actually really welcome, because you know what it feels like when you're a minority and someone's telling you you can do anything. It's actually a really empowering thing. But I want to put a quote out there. There was a great church sign in Florida from last year. Incidentally, this is a golden moment for political humor, right? Like, if anything else, the last like year has been just amazing from the point of view of like humor and politics. So remember Anthony Scaramucci? So he had tweeted out a picture of the menu on Air Force One, and he tweeted, "Honored and humbled to be here. It'll never get old." And someone retweeted, "It certainly did not get old." There was a church sign in Florida, and the church sign said, "Maybe it's time we stop telling people anyone can be president." Which is good, right? That's a sermon topic for you if you want, you know. So, you know, my dad knows I wrote the book. He never read the book. I don't think he'll read the book, and I'm actually really okay with that. Right? Like, it's great in theory that he knows the book is written. I would be horrified by my dad. For the audiobook, actually, it would be great if I read the book out loud while he beat me to death, right? So like, where I read the part about where I sneak out to prom, right? He'd be like, "What?" And then, or like, "What?" And then, you know, he would just like beat me to death. So my dad has not read the book. At one point, he suggested he should read the book, and I was like, "No, it's okay." I was like, "Why don't we just read Quran together?" And he was like, "Okay." And then, see, you can always use God to your advantage.
Apart from that, what advice would you give to young Muslims in light of the current situation?
I wonder what it's like to grow up right now. I really mean that. It's such an interesting thing, right? I feel like for all of us, we have these parts of our life that are so formative, right? Like what was going on in American culture kind of defines who you are based on when you grew up. And so for me, I became politically conscious during the Clinton years, right? So for better and for worse, my default America is like Bill Clinton, right? Which is interesting because if you think about it, that was after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Before 9/11, when the country had problems, but none of them seemed beyond our ability to surmount, right? It actually seemed like this very nice period of like remarkable American hegemony, when you felt like you had problems as a society, but the society was secure enough and wealthy enough and confident enough to address them. Then I wondered what it must be like to grow up and you come of age when Obama was president, and how weird it must be that your default for America is a black guy whose middle name is Hussein, which is so interesting to think about. And now, imagine you are an American Muslim growing up and your default for president is Donald Trump. And I actually have no easy answer to this question because I don't have kids, but I can't imagine what it must be like to be a parent with children who are of an impressionable age and to have to explain to them that that kind of behavior is inappropriate. Because normally when presidents lie, right? Like, it's not so like bald and in your face that like a 10-year-old is gonna get it. Like, George Bush is making stuff up about WMDs is like not gonna be like a talking point, right? Like no one's gonna get into like tax policy, right? But when it's like in your face blatant lying and vulgarity, what do you do with that? And one of the things I often say to younger Muslims is, you know, whether we like it or not, this is our reality. And to experience it by getting outside of a Muslim box. And so to understand, and this is what I meant by the airport point, that, you know, it is not the case that it is simply one community that is sort of under the microscope, right? It is that many different types of Americans feel deeply unsettled in this moment, and to allow yourself to step out of that and to experience their anxiety is a way of building a relationship with another type of person, which is valuable. It is also a way of realizing that you are not alone, and it is also a way of realizing that the problems we have should be kept, I guess, in light of their actual provenance at the moment. And I think it's easy when you focus on yourself and the threat to yourself to exaggerate the problem out of all, you know, kind of reasonableness, because it seems horrible if you just focus on that one moment. The second thing I tell people to do is to get off of social media. I think social media has become a disaster. I think it's a useful tool, don't get me wrong, but by and large it promotes incivility, It doesn't really encourage pluralism. It mostly wastes your time. And the energy you could use at building real relationships, educating yourself, taking care of yourself, becoming more spiritually engaged, becoming more educationally engaged, becoming more politically engaged, is dissipated into making yourself feel good. Even the most popular tweet that gets 20,000 retweets will never be remembered a year from now, unless I mention it in the course of political comedy, right? Because it's like Anthony Scaramucci, but that was funny, right? Like, that's okay. Like Comedy Central did this one where there was like R.I.P. Anthony Scaramucci, July 2017 to slightly later in July 2017, which was also amazing. But my point being that, it's easy to be in a silo. And sometimes when I go on social media, I realize to myself, like, it's great, like everyone's retweeting this, but we're just retweeting what we already agree with. And there's obviously value in rallying the base and learning what people think and all of that stuff. But I do think that, in retrospect, imagine where that energy could be put otherwise. I took Twitter off my phone and I felt better for it. I went on a 1-month Facebook fast and felt much better for it. And I do think that sometimes in this moment, and maybe this is a good place to end. I don't know if we have more questions, you tell me. One more question. So I'll say this. When the political culture is angry, the temptation is to be angry in response. I would suggest that the better thing to do is to model a different kind of leadership. If the leadership that we are seeing right now is cult of personality and hierarchical, then we should model forms of leadership that are pluralistic and collaborative, and that are not angry, but that are patient and calm. And maybe social media isn't the best place for that.
We do want to give Washingtonians who have to rush home to write a memo for their boss for tomorrow, or get a good night's sleep, that opportunity. So we are planning to wrap up at 9, and Haroon is just now about to agree to sign books for those who would like to have him do so.
I'll sign any book, not just my own. Yeah.
But only if you buy that book, whatever it is.
Yes, or if you've already purchased the book and it's not mine, just pay me the cash value of the book and I'll sign it.
But I thought I'd ask you one easy question before we let you off the hook here. I had the wonderful fortune to be in Jerusalem, as you mentioned earlier, with you and with members of the Muslim Leadership Initiative. And that was an extraordinary experience, and I think there is never an ordinary experience traveling to Jerusalem, but this week has brought it again into very sharp focus. So do you want to just say a few words about the status of Jerusalem, how you read this week's events, and how you look ahead to its future? I know, an easy one, Haroon, come on.
Can I ask you what the hard question would have been?
Right.
How tall am I? It's classified. Sometimes when I lose things, I email myself on the belief that like the NSA is reading my email and ask them to find it for me, but they never cooperate. And like, if we're going to have a surveillance state, it should work both ways, right?
Really?
Like, hey, where did I put that folder I need for work tomorrow? And I just send it to myself. And no one responds. It's really rude. Jerusalem. So I work for the Hartman Institute, so thank you for making this uncomfortable. I wrote my first op-ed for NBC News 2 days ago, in which I argued that I think ultimately the recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel may actually be a good thing, but that's because I believe in a one-state solution. Yeah. I don't believe that the two-state solution is a practical solution. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think that the only non-violent outcome anyone can hope for is some kind of confederation of two peoples in one land, meaning from the river to the sea. And so to me, ultimately, saying that we shouldn't wait for an embassy to be moved or that we should just acknowledge Jerusalem as the capital of Israel isn't really, it's just kind of the final nail, or one of the final nails in the coffin of the two-state solution. And I think that there's something cruel about stringing people along in the belief that at some point you may one day decide to give them the peace and the security and the dignity they deserve. And as painful as it must be in this moment and for all the unrest that it unleashes, at least we can begin disabusing ourselves of a status quo that is just going to get worse. And so, in answer to your question, I am hopeful that this encourages people to think outside of the two-state box, and a larger point, to think more creatively about how to solve conflicts and not just inhabit the templates that we have received. Yeah, and I will sign books, and I promise that I will spell your name as well as the people at Starbucks do.
Thank you. Thank you, Haroon, for spending all this time with us and for sharing your insights, for your honesty and your ability to go to places of vulnerability with a level of courage and humor that we're really blessed to have had the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you so much, and we look forward to more engagements in the future and more books, I hope, that hopefully Beacon Press will continue to publish.
Thank you.
And I'd like to give you all an opportunity to connect with Haroon as he signs some of his books and also have a chance to ask any other questions you may have. And also, I want to mention that we will continue to be doing these evening forums, and right now we have a tentative commitment, which I'm hoping will be confirmed tomorrow, for our January forum, which is January 7th, with Senator Chris Van Hollen. So we will, of course, be sending out notice once we have that confirmed. So thank you again for coming out tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful night and a great week ahead. Thank you.
Well done, sir.